this week. So when we look at the back, we have a huge expanse muscle. So when we talked about the posterior shoulder, we talked about the rhomboids, the infraspinatus, supraspinatus, teres minor, and teres major. Talked about a little bit about the tricep, the rhomboids, levator scaps. Now we have to learn how to integrate all this, and this is why we're doing the back after the shoulder, because when we look at actions of the shoulder, two major movers that we have here, you have your lats and your traps. And I want you to notice the shape of these two muscles and really where they're coming from and where they're going, because it's going to play into how we train the back. So when we look here at the lat, it's originating basically from T12, so the lower part of your thoracic spine, and runs and attaches all the way down to your L5 and your S1. So you're basically the top of your pelvis all the way up through your lumbar spine and into your back. When we look at the function of that lat, what it's going to do is it's going to extend your shoulder. So think about bringing your shoulder blade back. And we can kind of see it has some attachment to the scapula, and then it actually inserts. If we were to come to the front side of the shoulder and start cutting stuff away here, boom, and then we click on this right here, that's your lat. So it really comes under the shoulder all the way up to the inside. So it internally rotates your humerus and helps extend your shoulder. Then we start to look at the traps. This is a pretty big one. The one thing that's going to get really tricky here, look at the muscle fiber orientations. So we have three different muscle fiber orientations that are going to happen at the trap. We have the upper fibers that run down, almost like a negative line on like a XY axis, that run down towards the top border of the scapula. We have the mid trap, which runs horizontally, and then we have a vertical diagonal pull from basically T. We could go into this like really in depth, insertion origin. If we look at the trapezius, so C7 to T12, going back there. So C7 to C12, and it basically pulls along that upper border of the scapula. So when we look at the back, we have to understand, especially from a surface level, these two muscles do a ton of work. Then we cut those away. We start to look at coming down your serratus posterior. This is keeping the rib cage and being able to compress and expand the rib cage. We won't go over compression and expansion as much, because when we talk about training the back, it's not quite as it's not quite as necessary as talking about the basics first. So we're going to get rid of the serratus posterior. The big thing, and you'll see these here, these are what I like to call the bread lobes. So your iliacus and your longissimus. So basically, these two are what we call the spinal erectors. And so the spinal erectors start obviously here at your pelvis, and they run, some of them run all the way up to your neck and the top upper ribs, right? So if we look here, we have our longissimus, we have the iliacus that runs all the way up to the top rib, and then they start to play into other ones. So when we start training the back, we look at what those are. Now, the function of those spinal erectors, because that's just the group of muscles when we group them together, when we look at the spinal erectors, the big thing that we're looking at is that they function isometrically as a primary function. So they don't sit there and do tons of extension work. Now, they can, but then we start to look, and we talked about it with the core and the spine. We start to look deeper. All of a sudden, we start to see that we basically have these very long muscles that we're sitting there trying to resist flexion. So we're going to cut those away even further. The other one you'll hear a lot about is this guy. So this is the Quadratus Lumborum, or the QL. When we look at training that, it's basically coming in and helping keep the pelvis and the rib cage in line. So especially, we talked about the core a little bit, ribs, pelvis, spine, trying to keep everything stable. Especially from the QL aspect, this functions isometrically to keep everything upright, and then also to help create and resist movement. So especially when we look at our rotational movements at the spine, your QL is one of those that really helps stabilize that pelvis and that rib cage. So there's our basic overview of the back. We could get into the multifidi, especially when the multifidi get really locked up and really tight. We tend to have a lot of nerve issues, like we were to add the nerves in here. If you hear somebody that talks about sciaticus, so sciaticus comes down. Where is it? Oh, a little hard to pinpoint here. Trying to find it. It's basically it's in this complex of nerves. But when the multifidi get tight, you'll see the sacrum and the pelvis have some issues with that. So when we look at the back, we're looking primarily at isometrics through those longer muscles, so your thoracic, the longissimus, and then also through the QL when we look at training the back and incorporating with the posterior shoulder. That's where we start to talk about stability and creating strength through the lats and through the trapezius. So there's your overview of the back. That's what we'll be going over in class, and just so you can kind of see it from an anatomical perspective.